Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're telling the story of Ezra McCandless, who was convicted of murdering Alex Woodworth by stabbing him over 16 times. This story is so cold and heartless. I'm going to sort of tell you the whole story of her life for the year prior to the incident. And I feel like it's important because you can see what she was going through and how her different relationships were. I did put the chapters in the comment section, so you can always skip ahead if you don't want to hear something. Ezra McCandless was born with the name Monica J. on October 6, 1998, to a 14-year-old mother named Rosalina Gunnelson in Stanley, Wisconsin. I couldn't really find much at all about her bio dad, but he wasn't really a part of her life as a child. Rosalina, Ezra's mom, did have a partner named Joshane Carlin who adopted Monica, Ezra, when she was between the ages of 4 and 5 years old. Ezra's parents would divorce when she was 12, but she always remained really close to her dad. While in high school, Ezra, who was still going by the name Monica, experimented with other names and also other pronouns. She leaned more towards being masculine in high school, but would consider herself fluid. She would eventually change her name to Ezra McCandless. The first name Ezra because she first saw the name on a wonderful family camping trip. She liked it because it wasn't really masculine or feminine, which felt right to her. And McCandless after Chris McCandless. Chris McCandless is the person who the book and movie Into the Wild is about. And if you don't know what that book is about, he basically hiked over all of North America and found himself living in Alaska, off the land in an abandoned bus. He would sadly die in that bus, presumably from starvation. So in a nutshell, that was what the books were about. Anyway, he was an adventurer and Ezra really liked his story. By the age of 20, Ezra was leaning more towards her feminine side, but still often dressed and acted masculine. People would describe Ezra as artistic and amazing, and she loved to be around people and was just generally happy. Ezra briefly went to college after high school, but dropped out and made her way to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and worked in the school district. While in Wisconsin, she met Jason Mengal, a 34-year-old medic in the Army who also worked at a bar sort of coffee shop called Racy's. Their relationship was said to go pretty fast, and Ezra would move out of her mother's home in Stanley, Wisconsin, and move in with Jason in Eau Claire in August of 2017, only about a month after they met. It's said that Jason really treated Ezra well, at least in the beginning of their relationship, and she would also say that she was deeply in love with him. When Ezra moved in with Jason, she also met a man named Alex Woodworth, who was 23 years old and also worked at Racy's coffee shop. She met Alex at Racy's, and she noticed him sitting alone writing, and this intrigued her. They would have a brief conversation on cannibalism and their love for spiders. Ezra did mention that the cannibalism was more philosophical, but Jason had interrupted their conversation, but she just wasn't able to get Alex and the conversation out of her head. She just was really interested in him. So Ezra would continue to see Alex at the coffee shop, and they eventually became good friends. By early October, just 2 months of living with Jason, Ezra started to feel sick and she was throwing up a lot. So she took a pregnancy test at a gas station and she was in fact pregnant. On October 6th, her birthday, Ezra would abort the baby because she said she was just too young and confused and not really ready for a baby. Ezra would say that things between her and Jason became distant after that. And Jason would reject her and he'd sleep on the couch and they just lacked intimacy. And Jason would also say this as well. The abortion had really hit him hard, and he didn't have a say in Ezra's abortion. He supported her decision and thought that it was her body, so he just went along with whatever she wanted. Jason was also regularly playing Dungeons and Dragons with his friends on Monday nights. He tried to have Ezra come to one of those game nights and participate. Essentially, he thought getting her to play a fantasy game would be a good distraction for everything that they were going through. In his mind, he thought pretending to be a different character would be a good distraction. But she didn't like it and actually would try and stop Jason from attending Monday night game nights. And it's not said why she didn't want Jason to go, but oftentimes she would threaten to harm herself if he'd leave to go play these games with his friends. Strangely, Ezra also claimed that Jason would become emotionally abusive towards her. He'd blame her for being clumsy, and he got mad at her once for losing a Sharpie, or that he didn't like her makeup. And I guess this hurt her feelings. And I don't know if these were just little fights or bickering, but it seems like these things just weren't good for their relationship after the abortion. To Ezra, he started to remind her of her father, who often called her stupid or yelled at her or criticized her. Now, while her relationship with Jason was starting to strain, her relationship with Alex would get stronger. They had philosophical conversations, long walks, and she would say that she was his yin to his yang. Ezra would also confide in Alex about her abortion, and Alex really comforted her, more so than Jason. Jason actually didn't mind that Ezra and Alex were friends. He would say that he actually encouraged it because it seemed like she finally had someone to talk to. What Jason didn't know was that they would become sexual partners while she was still with Jason. Ezra would even spend the night at his house while Jason was away on work trips. Throughout December, Alex would write in his journal about depression, eroticism, and metaphors about cannibalism. And he was also hurt by the fact that Ezra was still with Jason and wouldn't 100% be with him. It almost seems like he was in a low place, and so was Ezra. And you can say misery loves company. Their sexual relationship would be entering into a BDSM territory by January. Ezra would then say that Alex often didn't ask her consent, and she was just getting very uncomfortable by their relationship near February. However, she never said no to him or asked him to stop. Her relationship with Jason was also continuing to crumble. Ezra just wasn't happy, so they would break up, but they'd still live together. In February, she would also start hanging out with a man named John Hansen, and she had a crush on him, and he was a friend of Alex and Jason's. One night when Jason had gone out of town, and according to Ezra, she and John would get together to do some painting, and he brought wine, and Ezra would get drunk. She claims that she would black out a few times, according to her, and she was sexually assaulted by John Hansen twice. Once in his apartment while she was passed out drunk, and again the next morning while she was getting changed at her own apartment. On record, she said she did not say no or resist him the next morning while still in her apartment. Now, Jason was away on National Guard duty when this all happened, and Ezra also moved out of his house while he was gone. Ezra would move back into her mother's house in Stanley, Wisconsin, and Alex would actually assist her in moving, but she would break up with him by text because she was not ready for intense expectations. And not long after, she actually left her mother's house and went to live with her dad. And her dad would testify that the 2 weeks she was living with him, she was rarely even home. Now, even though her and Jason were broken up, she was still texting Jason, calling him, and would say their relationship was complicated. They still loved each other, and I think they were trying to see if they could rekindle their relationship. Jason said that Ezra still wasn't welcome in his home, so he would book hotel rooms for them. It seemed like he was going to elaborate while on trial the opinions of his roommates toward Ezra, but the judge actually interrupted, saying that he didn't want their opinions, so all he did confirm was that she wasn't welcome in his home. I'm going to assume because of the roommates. Anyway, One night after he stayed with her, the next morning, Ezra would wake up to see Jason looking through her phone, which I believe was actually an iPod. She didn't have a phone, so she would just download apps into her iPod, and she had a messenger app on there. Jason would read flirty messages from John and became really angry. And according to Jason, these flirty messages were sent after the alleged assault. So he was confused by this and also hurt. Jason would call John to confront him, and then he put Ezra on the phone, and John actually admitted to having sex with Ezra. Jason would then get Ezra's side of the story, which was totally different than what she told everyone on trial. She would say that she had been out drinking with John and his friend Ryan, who was John's roommate, and the boys were giving her a hard time for not being able to keep up drinking. So she had thrown up in the toilet and then went to bed. And she doesn't remember much, but something just felt off. And this was obviously very upsetting for Jason. They had to check out of the hotel, so they would go to their friend Josh's house, where Jason continued to be irate. Josh would call the police because Jason just seemed very out of control and angry. And from what I understand, when the police arrived, Ezra didn't want to talk about the assault at Josh's house, so she would go to the police station to speak with the police about what happened with John, but her story just didn't sit right. So the police did investigate, and they also interviewed Alex Woodworth as part of the investigation, but he said it was a lie. Ezra willingly slept with John Hansen and had regretted it. John denied the rape as well, so the case was dropped because there was just no proof of her claim. No police report, no hospital visit, just something she told Jason after he discovered the flirty texts. Ezra and Jason would continue to spend time together, talked about counseling, and they were still sleeping together as well. She felt that they were still both in love, which is a contrast of the abusive person she described him earlier. Ezra ended up waking up March 22nd with this urge that she needed to run some errands. Ezra would eventually show up at Racy's Coffee where Jason was. And Jason said that Ezra seemed really agitated and there was just something odd. And saying that she needed to go to Alex's house and give him some journals. She also mentioned that she needed to be done with the negativity and return things that made her feel sad. During the trial, it said that it was a heating pad and some bookmarks. Jason didn't have a good feeling about the way Ezra was acting, so he rode his bike to Alex's house to make sure she was okay. He would see her car parked outside with the engine running. And thinking she was just going to return shortly, Jason stayed outside and would talk to Ezra when she came back to her car. And witnesses would see Jason pacing around outside, and they would call police because he was the one that looked suspicious. 45 minutes would pass, and Ezra and Alex would get into her car and continue their conversation. And while Jason was waiting around, he would be met by police. Jason told police that he was only there because he was worried about Ezra, and she was acting really strange. Police would then decide that there was no issues or anything bad happening, so they left. And Jason would also leave because there really wasn't anything he could do.
Stand by, Mark. Hi. Is everything okay here?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody called us kind of worried because they saw Jason come over here and he was going in the car and they weren't sure what was going on.
No. Everything's fine.
Everything's fine? Okay. Do you guys have any ID with you? Just
Yeah.
I got to write a report here that I came over and talked with you guys. They were just a little worried.
Alex and Ezra would go for a drive, and the next thing we know for sure is that at 4:15 p.m., Ezra would knock on the door of Don Sippel's home. He was a dairy farmer in Springbrook, not far from Eau Claire. It said that Ezra was covered in mud, bloody, bruised, and was also barefoot. Her clothes would also be torn, and Ezra would ask Dawn to call 911 saying that someone had assaulted her. Dawn was pretty shaken up by this. Like, how weird would it be if a woman just showed up at your house looking ratty and bloody? Ezra also had the word boy carved into her arm. While Ezra was still at Dawn's, she would whimper and cry for someone to contact Jason Mengal. When the first deputy arrived, they remembered that while Ezra seemed to be crying, there was actually no tears. He took her statement, and Ezra was then taken to the hospital in Eau Claire. While in the hospital, Ezra originally claimed that she couldn't actually remember what happened. But after speaking with police again, she would say that she could feel the feelings but not see the scene. She knew Alex had a knife and was dangerous. So police took this information and they tried to find Alex to ask him what happened. Why did he attack Ezra? And the fact that he actually carved boy into her arm was very alarming. Investigators would go out to the dairy farm, and on their way, they would see Ezra's car parked haphazardly on the side of a mucky dirt road. They would also see bloody footprints on the ground, as well as Alex's body hanging out of the back of Ezra's car. He had around 16 stab wounds to his head, neck, torso, and groin. Police would also find an EMT knife in the ditch and the back cover of a cell phone. Ezra would be arrested in connection to the death of Alex Woodworth with a charge of first-degree intentional homicide. It would be over a year and a half before her trial started at the Dunn County Judicial Center. Now, remember how Ezra claimed she couldn't remember what happened to her, but she thought she was assaulted? Well, during various police interviews, police told Ezra that they found Alex's body in her car, and then she all of a sudden remembered that he attacked her and said that Alex told her that he wanted to have her, quote, one last time, end quote. Now, when police asked her if she thought Alex was going to sexually assault her, she seemed unsure, and she thought that maybe he just wanted to look at her. Now, remember the word boy in her arm? Apparently, Alex used to call her boy, and that he preferred it when she presented more masculine.
Feeling so anxious.
Okay. And so how does your arm get cut up?
Alex, he grabbed it, and then he kept telling me about being a boy and stuff like that, how frustrating it is. And then he threatened me.
What do you mean he threatened you?
He didn't say he was gonna do something, but he grabbed me and started doing something.
What do you mean he started doing something?
He started carving something in my arm.
Where is this on your arm?
His arm.
Can I see?
She really didn't like him calling her boy because Ezra felt it made her seem like a possession, that she was Alex's boy. But she would later admit that she cut her hand and it was actually her that carved her arm, after police pointed out that it looked self-inflicted based on the angle of her wounds. She would then explain that the two of them had gone for a car ride, just to go somewhere private to speak, but then they got stuck in the mud. So at this point, they got out of the car to check to see how stuck they were. But they didn't think to call a tow truck. Instead, she would search her trunk for anything to help get them unstuck. Now, for some reason, she began to rearrange her car. She moved items from the trunk to the passenger seat, like a painting or a picture, and she grabbed a blanket and a pillow would fall out onto the ground. But finally, she would walk away from the car and stand looking towards the woods beside a large shipping container that was just off the road on someone's property. Ezra claims that Alex would come up to her from behind and he tried to hug Ezra while she was looking into the woods. And he'd let her go and suggest that maybe she'd go lay down in the car to relax. I guess she was having some anxiety, so she agreed because perhaps laying down for a bit would help. I don't suffer from major anxiety, but to me, going for a little lay down just seems kind of strange. Why wouldn't they call for help or go walk towards the main road to find help? Anyway, she would then say that Alex would come to the back seat to join her for their little laydown. While in the back seat, he apparently took off her glasses, which makes it very difficult for her to see, and she's basically blind without her glasses. But Alex would then tie a scarf around her face, and she claims that he would then cut open the front of her sweater with a knife. I should mention that the knife used was an EMT knife that belonged to her father. Her father owned a tree cutting business and typically had 1 or 2 EMT knives around the house. Ezra said that she used to work for her dad and often carried around similar knives. Now remember, Ezra had been staying with her dad at the time of the incident, and during the trial, her dad mentioned that one of the knives was actually missing from the home. But he claims that it wasn't alarming or unusual because his knives go missing all the time. Take what you will from that. Let's continue. While in the back seat, Alex also began pricking her skin with the knife. And then he starts cutting her pants and cutting her legs, which are quite superficial and not very deep at all. A doctor would later reveal that these leg scratches were in fact self-inflicted. Ezra said she got scared and kicked him in the groin, even though she said that he was actually straddling her, so I'm not sure how she did that. But then she somehow got the knife away from Alex and started to stab him. Quote, anywhere and everywhere, end quote, including his head. According to the autopsy report, Alex was stabbed in his groin, in his neck. His neck was actually sliced several times as well as stabbed. She managed to sever his jugular, and he was also stabbed on his back several times and on the left side of his torso, which actually hit his lungs, as well as a stab wound in his head. The one in his skull was so deep and done with such force that the knife went through his skull. When Alex was brought in, he was also fully dressed. His pants were completely done up, and his belt was also fully buckled. So he wasn't actively raping Ezra. She claimed that she attacked him inside the car, but the majority of the blood would actually be found outside of the car. Evidence would also show that there was very little blood inside the vehicle at all. And considering his wounds were so deep and there were so many, that's really surprising. The doctor who did the autopsy also said that the hit to the jugular resulted in a lot of bleeding. She also said that the results of his injuries would have killed him very quickly. Now, according to Ezra, she somehow got out of the car after the attack, and she walked away from the car. And apparently, according to Ezra, Alex also got out of the car, and then he asked her help going to the bathroom. So reluctantly, she decides to walk back towards Alex to help him because, by her own admissions, that's just her nature. She's a very helpful person. She claims he then pulls her in tight to his body, and she reaches around to stab him again in the back. She then gets loose from his grip and goes back into the car and just sits there trying to compose herself. She says that she looked over towards Alex and he was taking off his coat. He laid it on the ground and then would lay on top of his coat, and she could hear him talking away to himself. The medical examiner would testify that a lot of Alex's injuries would be peri-mortem, meaning that he was in the midst of dying while she was stabbing him, particularly the stabbing to his left side of his body, which actually punctured his left lung. So it's really impossible that Ezra's version of him walking around, asking to use the bathroom, laying down, and talking even happened. The blood loss from the jugular and the wound to his lung would have made him quite weak. I should mention that Alex was found without shoes on as well by police inside the car, and his socks were clean. Ezra says that while sitting in the car, she finally puts her glasses back on. So now she could see what happened. Remember, she says she's almost blind without them, so it's amazing that she was able to see him walk around and lay his coat down to lie on top of it. She still has the knife at this point, and this is when she carves Boy into her arm. At the trial, she claims that she just doesn't know why she did that. She just can't explain it. She then decided to leave the scene. She picked up Alex's phone to call police, but she didn't. She would go wandering away and claim to have tripped and fallen and dropped and broke the phone. So instead, she would walk away looking for someone to help and would come across Dawn's farmhouse. Never once did Ezra say that she stabbed Alex or that she left him in the car. She did not try and help him at all. It really just seems like she left him for dead. If you take a look at how Alex was in the car, and warning, I'm going to show you the picture in 3, 2, 1. He was smack dab in the middle of the back seat of the car, not laying on a coat like she said. Prosecutors would say that Alex was more than likely attacked outside the vehicle and climbed back inside to get away from Ezra or to try and find his phone to call 911. Prosecutors also suspect that Ezra tried to pull Alex out of the vehicle after he died to try and stage a different sort of scene, but ultimately wedged him further behind the seats, and this is when his shoes came off during this struggle. At the preliminary hearing, Judge Peterson actually wondered if Ezra was even fit to stand trial because of some of the things she was saying or how she was acting. So he actually sent her for a competency evaluation. Ezra would also try to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but her defense attorneys couldn't meet the burden of proof of insanity. So basically, they needed to prove that she didn't understand her actions at the time of the incident due to mental disease. Ezra was deemed fit to stand trial, and she changed her plea from not guilty by reason of insanity to just not guilty. And the trial was interesting because there was no witnesses, so Ezra would actually testify at her own trial. Prosecutors said they believe that Ezra stabbed Alex because she thought that he'd get in the way of her rekindling her relationship with Jason, or he would tell Jason everything because they did know each other. They worked together at Racy's coffee shop. Her defense tried really hard to make it seem that Alex was unhinged by revealing so many of his journal entries and his obsessions, a lot of which even Ezra said were just metaphorical. The judge actually had to put a stop to it because it went on for over 4 hours. The first thing that I noticed was how happy Ezra seemed to be speaking at the trial. She was smiling and happy and very polite, and at other times during the trial, Ezra would actually start laughing. Even her ex-boyfriend, Jason, noticed that while on the stand, she almost seemed like she enjoyed it. It was odd how calm and relaxed she was, even when discussing Alex. She described him fondly, and she was smiling, and she didn't seem upset or shameful or remorseful at all. Even when they discussed in detail Alex's injuries, she didn't seem upset. In fact, through most of the trial, she just had her head down and was sketching drawings of herself and Alex, kind of ignoring what was going on. Jason testified as well, and when his name was called up, Ezra actually perked up and she would look around the back of the room just to try and watch him come forward. Jason also noticed that Ezra wore a green sweater under her pink blazer, and he had gotten her that sweater while she was in the hospital. He felt that by her wearing the sweater, it was a game and she was just being emotionally manipulative. Ezra's journals were also brought up as well for evidence. And what's interesting about her journals is that she kept them online, and she said that she updated them and changed them often. And I have never heard of anyone editing or updating past journal entries. People generally don't go back and change things. In fact, she actually updated entries the day before the murder. And another interesting detail that emerged was that Ezra actually had someone proofread her journals. And I have also never heard of that before either. Ezra's journals also showed that their relationship was often violent, but I question the authenticity of some of these since they were changed pretty regularly. Perhaps a person who is planning on killing someone might update their journals to make it look like they were a victim. Anyways, November 1st, 2019, Ezra was convicted to stabbing Alex to death. Then on February 7th, 2020, she was sentenced to life with eligibility of parole after 50 years. Her mother, Rosalina, tried to ask the court to grant her daughter parole after only 20 years. And she tried to take the blame, saying that Ezra just didn't get the attention she deserved as a child, and the divorce was really hard on Ezra. Judge James Peterson said that he wasn't really sure that Ezra still wouldn't be a danger to society in only 20 years. And he said that Ezra didn't really show any sadness or compassion or even remorse throughout the trial. A lot of the trial is on Court TV, so if you're interested, you can find it there. And when I watched it, I noticed that Ezra only cried when she was able to address the judge during sentencing. She all of a sudden showed sadness. She would tell the courts that she loved Alex very much, and she too was feeling great loss. Ezra has since spoken out and basically has defended her actions during the trial. She hadn't seen a lot of her family members in a really long time, so seeing them again at the trial just made her happy. And that's why she was in a good mood. She also said that the trial portrayed her as a sex fiend and a liar, so she will continue to battle for justice. My thoughts? I hope she gets some therapy in prison because to me it just seems like she's a little unstable. Now, I don't know if it was the abortion or her loneliness or what, but there's just something about her. With that said, her demeanor really reminded me of Jodi Arias. She kind of had the soft voice and had the same polite disposition as Jodi Arias. And I feel like both Jodi and Ezra's demeanors on the stand were eerily similar. They tried to portray themselves as gentle and that these murders were only self-defense, even though evidence painted a completely different picture. To me, her lack of emotion was a little disturbing during the trial. If you watch the trial, it's pretty clear that Ezra has gone through a lot of trauma. And I don't know what finally made her crack, but all of her lies and how her story keeps changing, and she just has no emotion towards it, so it just all seemed very callous to me. Ezra's Instagram is still actually active, and I believe it's being run by her mother or someone very close to her. You can't comment on anything, but basically it's just pictures of art pieces that Ezra has done and is selling. I personally wouldn't buy anything and support her, but who knows where that money is going. Maybe it's to her mom, or maybe she can buy commissary in prison. I don't know. Anyways, that's it for today. I hope you guys liked this episode. If you don't want to miss another one, please hit subscribe and we'll see you next week.